On a chilly winter evening, Ethan came upon a peculiar sight at his doorstep. The biting cold of the wind carried with it a faint cry, and upon investigating, he discovered an unexpected visitor. A wild bobcat stood just outside his porch, her amber eyes fixed on him with a mix of caution and desperation. Her fur was thick and wild, but her ribs pressed faintly against her sides, suggesting she had endured a hard journey. Behind her, two cubs huddled close, their tiny bodies trembling in the cold. Ethan froze. His initial reaction was one of disbelief. A bobcat, and with cubs no less. The situation was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Yet, as he stood there, the bobcat lifted one paw and pressed it against the glass of his door. It was almost as if she were asking permission to enter. The sheer audacity of her actions made Ethan hesitate. He had heard stories of wild animals seeking refuge during extreme weather, but seeing it unfold before him was surreal. He opened the door slightly, letting the warm air from inside escape into the night. The bobcat remained still, her cubs pressing tighter against her. Something about her gaze compelled Ethan to act. Ignoring the voice in his head warning him about the risks, he unbolted the door fully. To his surprise, the bobcat stepped inside cautiously, her cubs trailing after her. The icy wind followed, but he quickly shut the door, sealing out the cold. The bobcat's fur carried patches of frost, and her cubs were visibly shivering. She shook herself off, scattering droplets onto the wooden floor. Ethan stood at a safe distance, unsure of what to do next. The mother bobcat sniffed the air, her sharp eyes darting around the room. Her cubs clung to her legs, mewing softly. Ethan's heart softened at the sight. Whatever had driven this creature to his home must have been dire. Ethan retreated to the kitchen to prepare something warm. He didn't have anything specific for wild animals, but he found some leftover chicken and warmed it slightly. He placed it on a plate and set it on the floor a few feet away from the bobcat. She sniffed the air again before cautiously approaching. Her cubs followed, but she nudged them back, ensuring she inspected the food first. Satisfied it wasn't a threat, she began eating, her cubs joining in after a moment. Watching her, Ethan noticed her swollen belly. The realization hit him. She wasn't just a mother of two. She was pregnant. This explained her boldness in seeking shelter. He marveled at the trust she showed in allowing him near her cubs. Despite being a wild animal, she seemed to sense that Ethan meant no harm. The evening wore on, and Ethan found himself captivated by his unexpected guests. The cubs began to explore their surroundings, their curiosity overtaking their initial fear. They stumbled over furniture, their tiny paws slipping on the hardwood floor. The mother bobcat watched them closely, her ears twitching at every sound. Ethan couldn't help but smile at their antics. As the night deepened, the snowstorm outside intensified. Ethan prepared a makeshift bed for the bobcat and her cubs using blankets and an old mattress. He set it up in the corner of the living room near the fireplace. The mother bobcat approached it hesitantly, sniffing the fabric. Once she deemed it safe, she settled down, her cubs curling up beside her. Ethan watched from a distance, amazed at how naturally they fit into his home. The next morning, Ethan woke to find the bobcat still in her corner, her cubs nestled against her. She watched him with wary eyes as he moved about the house. He decided to check with his neighbors to see if anyone had encountered the bobcat before. Armed with his phone, he snapped a couple of photos and ventured out into the snow. The neighborhood was quiet, blanketed in white. Ethan knocked on a few doors, showing the photos to anyone who answered. Most were shocked to hear about a bobcat taking shelter in his home, but none recognized her or her cubs. One neighbor suggested calling animal control, but Ethan dismissed the idea. He couldn't bring himself to separate the mother from her cubs, especially in her condition. Returning home, Ethan searched online for any reports of missing bobcats or sightings in the area. He found nothing. The more he thought about it, the more he felt a sense of responsibility for the family. They had come to him for help, and he was determined to see them through this tough time. Over the next few days, Ethan adjusted to living with his unusual guests. He bought raw meat and other supplies to ensure the bobcat and her cubs were well fed. He also set up a small litter area in case they needed it. The mother bobcat remained cautious, but began to show signs of trust. She allowed Ethan to come closer, even letting him clean up around her without protest. One evening, as Ethan prepared dinner, he noticed the mother bobcat acting restless. She paced around the living room, her ears flattened and her tail twitching. He quickly realized what was happening. She was going into labor. Ethan scrambled to make her as comfortable as possible, adding more blankets to her corner and dimming the lights. The birth was a quiet affair, punctuated only by the soft cries of the newborn cubs. Ethan kept his distance, giving her the space she needed. When it was over, she lay exhausted but proud, her new cubs nursing at her side. Ethan felt a surge of admiration for her strength and resilience. He marveled at the tiny cubs, their eyes closed and their fur damp. They were perfect. Over the following weeks, Ethan's home transformed into a sanctuary. The bobcat family thrived under his care. The older cubs grew more adventurous, exploring every nook and cranny of the house. The newborns stayed close to their mother, their tiny cries filling the air. Ethan found himself completely enchanted by them. He invested in toys and climbing structures to keep the older cubs entertained and even researched ways to ensure the bobcats' health and safety. Despite their wild nature, the bobcats seemed to adapt well to life indoors. The mother maintained her vigilance, often watching Ethan with her piercing eyes, but her trust in him was evident. She allowed him to approach her cubs and even accepted food from his hand. Ethan, in turn, respected her boundaries and worked to create a balance that suited them both. The snowstorm eventually passed, but Ethan knew he couldn't simply release the bobcat family back into the wild. The cubs were too young, and the mother still needed time to recover. He consulted with a local wildlife expert who advised him on how to care for them until they were ready to be reintroduced to their natural habitat. Months passed, and the bobcat family became an integral part of Ethan's life. The older cubs grew stronger and more independent, their playful antics bringing joy to his days. The newborns opened their eyes and began to explore, their tiny paws patting softly across the floor. The mother bobcat remained the heart of the family, her presence commanding respect and admiration. Ethan often reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful winter evening. His once quiet home was now filled with the sounds of life and laughter. The bond he had formed with the bobcat family was unlike anything he had ever experienced. They had come to him seeking refuge, but in the end, they had given him something far greater, a sense of purpose and connection. As spring approached, Ethan began to prepare for the next chapter. He worked with wildlife experts to ensure the bobcat family could safely transition back to the wild. It was a bittersweet process, but Ethan knew it was the right thing to do. He built an outdoor enclosure in his backyard to help them acclimate to the outside world. The mother bobcat took to it naturally, teaching her cubs the skills they would need to survive. The day eventually came when the bobcat family was ready to leave. Ethan opened the enclosure, watching as the mother led her cubs into the forest beyond. She paused at the edge of the trees, turning back to look at him one last time. Ethan felt a lump in his throat as he raised a hand in farewell. Then, with a flick of her tail, she disappeared into the wilderness, her cubs following close behind. Ethan stood there for a long time, the silence of the forest enveloping him. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the time they had shared. The bobcat family had left an indelible mark on his life, and he knew he would carry their memory with him always. In the months that followed, Ethan often found himself looking out into the woods, wondering how they were faring. He liked to imagine the mother bobcat teaching her cubs to hunt and climb, their wild spirits thriving in the freedom of nature. Though they were gone, their presence lingered in his home, in the toys they had played with and the memories they had created. Ethan's life returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was forever enriched by the experience. The Bobcat family had taught him the value of trust, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between living beings. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled outside, he would smile, remembering the warmth and love they had brought into his home.